Get out, you don't belong here. The loud voice of Sebastian, the white flight attendant, echoed through the air as he bounced on Dion Duncan, the black boy calmly requesting for juice. The piercing scream of 10-year-old Dion Duncan cut through the quiet hum of American Airlines Flight 1247's first-class cabin like a knife through silk. Blood streamed from his shattered jaw onto the cream-colored leather seats that cost more per flight than most people's monthly salary. "You little brat!" Sebastian Riff snarled, his hands still raised from the devastating slap that had just broken a child's face. "I told you, we were out of juice." Dion collapsed against his seat, crimson droplets spattering across the airline magazine in his lap. His small voice came out as barely a whisper through his damaged jaw. I just showed you the menu." Colin Paul, a businessman seated 3 rows back, had seen enough. He unbuckled his seatbelt and rushed forward. "Are you insane? He's just a kid." Sebastian's eyes blazed with uncontrolled rage. "Mind your own business." He shoved Colin hard, sending the Good Samaritan crashing into the armrest of seat 2C. Blood now trickled from Colin's split lip as he struggled to get back up. The entire first-class section had gone dead silent, except for Dion's quiet sobs and the steady drip of blood hitting the cabin floor. 37 passengers sat frozen in their seats, phones recording, mouths agape at the violence they'd just witnessed. "Someone needs to stop him," whispered an elderly woman in seat 3A, but nobody moved. Sebastian Riff was a 15-year veteran flight attendant, 6 feet tall and clearly unhinged. Suddenly, a loud footsteps was heard, and a man who could change the career of this racist flight attendant approached. Sebastian had no idea. He had just assaulted the son of the most powerful man on that plane. What happened next would obliterate more than just one man's career. It would expose a 15-year pattern of abuse, trigger a federal investigation that reached the highest levels of airline management, and ultimately transform how America protects its most vulnerable passengers. If you believe in justice, type justice, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if you want to see justice served in the most satisfying way possible, make sure to subscribe, because this story is about to get intense. To understand the horror of what just happened, you need to know who 10-year-old Dion Duncan really was. This wasn't just any child who had been brutally assaulted at 30,000 feet. This was a kid who had spent the entire week before his flight reading every airline safety card he could find online, practicing polite phrases in the mirror, and mapping out exactly how he would behave as a young gentleman traveling alone. Dion Duncan was the son of federal judge Michael Duncan, raised with values that most adults struggle to maintain. While other kids his age were glued to video games, Dion spent his free time reading about aviation history and dreaming of becoming a pilot someday. His bedroom walls were covered with pictures of aircraft, and he could identify the make and model of any plane just by looking at its silhouette. The divorce between his parents had been as amicable as divorce could be. No screaming matches, no custody battles, just 2 adults who realized they were better as co-parents than as husband and wife. Dion's mother had moved to Atlanta for a new job, and this flight was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter where Dion would spend summers with her and the school year with his father. Judge Duncan had specifically upgraded his son to first class for this inaugural solo journey. Not because the Duncans were wealthy, but because his father wanted Dion's first independent travel experience to be special. "You're representing our family up there," his father had told him during their practice conversations. "Show them what a Duncan man looks like." Dion had taken those words to heart. He'd practiced saying please, thank you, and excuse me, until they flowed naturally. He'd researched airplane etiquette and even watched YouTube videos about how to be a good passenger. This 10-year-old was more prepared for air travel than most adults who fly regularly. But there was something else about Dion that made what happened even more tragic. He was genuinely excited about everything. Excited about the plane, excited about seeing his mom, excited about proving to his father that he could handle this responsibility. When he buckled himself into seat 1B that morning, his smile had been so bright that even the gate agent commented on what a polite young man he was. Now let's talk about the monster who destroyed that innocence. Sebastian Riff had been a senior flight attendant for 15 years, and to most passengers, he seemed like the perfect airline employee. Charming smile, crisp uniform, smooth voice that could calm nervous flyers and make first-class passengers feel truly special. Adult passengers loved him. He remembered their drink preferences, asked about their families, and had a gift for making everyone feel like they were his personal priority. But Sebastian Riff had a secret that American Airlines had been covering up for over a decade. He targeted children traveling alone. Hidden in the airline's complaint database were 17 separate incidents involving Sebastian Riff and unaccompanied minors. 17 times, parents had called to report that their children had been treated roughly, spoken to harshly, or made to feel unwelcome during flights where Sebastian was working. 17 times, these complaints had been filed away, dismissed, or explained away by airline management who valued Sebastian's seniority and his popularity with adult passengers. Sebastian had a twisted belief system that he'd never openly admitted but had guided his actions for years. He genuinely believed that children, especially black children, needed what he called real discipline. In his warped mind, parents were too soft, society was too permissive, and these kids needed someone to show them their place. His resentment toward first-class passengers had been building for months. Sebastian made decent money as a senior flight attendant, but watching wealthy families upgrade their children while he struggled to pay his own bills after a bitter divorce had filled him with a toxic combination of envy and rage. The financial stress from his recent divorce had pushed Sebastian to a breaking point. His ex-wife had taken half of everything. His lawyer fees had drained his savings, and he was living paycheck to paycheck, while serving champagne to people who spent more on a single flight than he made in a month. But here's what makes this story even more chilling. Sebastian had been escalating. Those 17 complaints weren't just verbal incidents. 3 involved him grabbing children roughly. 2 included reports of him deliberately spilling drinks on young passengers. 1 described him locking a 7-year-old in the airplane bathroom for 10 minutes as punishment for asking too many questions. American Airlines knew all of this. Every single complaint, every incident report, every warning sign was sitting in Sebastian Riff's employee file, and they did nothing. What do you think airlines should do when flight attendants show a pattern of targeting children? Let me know in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed, because what Judge Duncan discovers about this cover-up will shock you to your core. Sebastian Riff thought he was disciplining another entitled kid that morning. What he had actually done was assault the son of one of the most powerful federal judges in the country, in front of 37 witnesses, while being recorded on multiple cell phones. The reckoning was about to begin. The moment that changed everything happened in less than 3 seconds. Sebastian Riff's hand came across Dion Duncan's face with the force of a sledgehammer. The sound of the impact echoed through the first-class cabin like a gunshot. This wasn't a disciplinary tap or even a harsh slap. This was a full-grown man striking a 10-year-old child with enough violence to shatter bone. The crack was audible. Passengers later described it as the most sickening sound they'd ever heard. Dion's small jaw snapped under the devastating force, fragments of bone shifting inside his face as he crumpled against his seat. Colin Paul didn't hesitate. The moment he saw Sebastian's hand connect with that child's face, every protective instinct in his body activated. He launched himself from his seat, shouting, "Get away from him!" But Sebastian Riff had crossed a line that no rational person crosses, and he wasn't done. When Colin tried to shield Dion, Sebastian grabbed the businessman by his shirt collar and slammed him into the armrest of seat 2C. Colin's head struck the metal with enough force to split his scalp, blood immediately streaming down his face. Dion collapsed to the cabin floor, his broken jaw already swelling, blood pooling beneath his small body on the pristine airplane carpet. His eyes were wide with shock and pain, but he couldn't speak. The fracture had damaged his ability to form words. That's when federal judge Michael Duncan rounded the corner. For a split second, the courtroom veteran didn't process what he was seeing. His son, on the floor, bleeding, a flight attendant standing over both his child and another passenger, both of whom were clearly injured. Then reality hit like a freight train. Duncan's transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The gentle father who had kissed his son goodbye that morning vanished, replaced by the federal authority who had sent murderers and terrorists to prison. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but carried the weight of absolute power. "Nobody move. Nobody speak. Federal Air Marshal, I need you here now." Sebastian Riff's face went white as he finally understood what he had done. This wasn't just any parent. This wasn't just any passenger. This was a federal judge, and Sebastian had just committed aggravated assault on his child in front of 36 witnesses. The federal air marshals who had been seated in economy rushed forward, their hands already reaching for restraints. Judge Duncan's judicial identification was already in his hand, his emergency contact information for federal law enforcement being dialed on his phone. "I am Federal Judge Michael Duncan of the Northern District of Illinois. This flight attendant has just committed felony assault on my 10-year-old son and attacked a passenger who tried to intervene. I am ordering an emergency landing and requesting immediate federal law enforcement response." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom within minutes. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an unscheduled landing in Nashville due to a federal law enforcement matter. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions." Sebastian Riff was zip-tied to his jump seat, his career over, his life destroyed, his freedom about to be taken away for the next decade. The man who had believed he could discipline children with impunity had just learned what real consequences looked like. Paramedics boarded the moment the plane touched down in Nashville. Dion was rushed to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where emergency surgeons worked for 4 hours to reconstruct his fractured jaw. The damage was so severe that he would need 3 additional surgeries and months of physical therapy to regain full function. Colin Paul required 18 stitches for his head wound, but refused treatment until he knew Dion was stable. This stranger had risked his own safety to protect a child he'd never met, and now he was being hailed as a hero by passengers who had witnessed his courage. Sebastian Riff was arrested on federal charges of aggravated assault, assault on a minor, and interference with flight crew duties. His mugshot would be on every major news network within hours. But the real story was just beginning. Passenger cell phone videos of the assault went viral within minutes of landing. "Justice for Dion" began trending worldwide. The footage was so clear, so undeniably brutal, that even American Airlines couldn't spin their way out of it. The airline's damage control team went into overdrive, releasing statements about how this was an isolated incident, how Sebastian Riff's actions didn't represent their values, how they were cooperating fully with authorities. Every word of it was a lie, and Judge Duncan knew it. Because Judge Duncan wasn't just a grieving father anymore. He was a federal authority with access to databases, legal channels, and investigative resources that most people can only dream of. And what he discovered in the days following his son's assault would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of American Airlines management. Working 18-hour days from his son's hospital bedside, Duncan began pulling threads that the airline had thought were buried forever. Sebastian Riff's employee file. Every complaint ever filed against him. Every incident report that had been dismissed or covered up. What he found was a 15-year pattern of abuse that American Airlines had not only ignored, but actively protected. Duncan connected with other families across the country whose children had been victimized by Sebastian Riff. Parents who had been told their complaints were unfounded. Families who had been offered flight vouchers to keep quiet. Children who had been traumatized by an airline employee while the company looked the other way. Each family Duncan contacted added another piece to a puzzle that revealed systematic negligence, deliberate cover-ups, and a corporate culture that valued profits over passenger safety. Judge Duncan was no longer just seeking justice for his son. He was building a federal case that would reshape the entire airline industry. What do you think should happen to companies that cover up employee misconduct involving children? Share your thoughts below. And make sure you subscribe because the evidence Judge Duncan uncovered will blow your mind. The man who had assaulted a 10-year-old boy, thinking he could get away with it, was about to learn that he had picked the wrong family to mess with. And American Airlines was about to discover that their years of protecting Sebastian Riff had just made them accomplices to federal crimes. The reckoning was coming, and it would be swift, brutal, and absolutely devastating. The federal courthouse in Chicago had never seen anything like it. Over 300 supporters packed the gallery, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent courtrooms. Parents who had flown across the country to witness justice, child advocacy groups, flight attendants who were disgusted by what their profession had been hiding. The media presence was so massive that additional security had to be brought in just to manage the crowds. Federal Judge Michael Duncan took the witness stand in his own son's case, a legal rarity that underscored just how personal this fight had become. His voice trembled as he described returning from that airplane restroom to find his 10-year-old son bleeding on the cabin floor. But his testimony was surgical in its precision. "I have presided over thousands of cases in my career," Duncan said, looking directly at Sebastian Riff. "I have seen the worst that humanity has to offer, but I have never witnessed such calculated cruelty toward a child as what this defendant did to my son." Then came the bombshell that destroyed any remaining sympathy for Sebastian Riff. The prosecution revealed that Sebastian hadn't just assaulted Dion Duncan. Over his 15-year career, he had accumulated 12 separate assault complaints involving children. 12 times, parents had reported that Sebastian had grabbed, shoved, or struck their kids. 12 times, American Airlines had buried those complaints in bureaucratic red tape. But it got worse. Internal emails obtained through federal subpoena showed that American Airlines executives had been actively covering up Sebastian's pattern of abuse. One email from a senior VP of customer relations actually read, "Riff is popular with premium passengers and generates significant revenue. A few complaints from kids shouldn't derail a profitable employee." They had valued money over children's safety. They had prioritized profit margins over protecting the most vulnerable passengers in their care. Former American Airlines employee Jennifer Walsh took the stand as a whistleblower, revealing that company policy explicitly instructed supervisors to dismiss complaints involving children as exaggerated or misunderstood. She testified that she had personally processed 17 complaints about Sebastian Riff over the years, and every single one had been filed away without investigation. "We were told that children's accounts weren't reliable," Walsh testified, fighting back tears. "We were instructed to offer flight vouchers to parents and close the cases. I participated in covering up child abuse, and I've carried that guilt for years." Colin Paul's testimony brought the entire courtroom to tears. This man had risked his own safety to protect a stranger's child, and his courage had prevented Sebastian from inflicting even more damage on Dion. "I didn't think about it," Colin said. "I just saw a grown man hurting a little boy, and I knew I had to do something. Every adult on that plane had a responsibility to protect that child, and I'm grateful I was able to step in, even for a moment." Sebastian Riff's defense team tried desperately to paint him as a stressed employee who had suffered a momentary lapse in judgment. They brought in character witnesses, talked about his divorce, mentioned his financial pressures. It was pathetic, and it failed spectacularly. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts: aggravated assault on a minor, federal assault charges, interference with flight operations, and civil rights violations for targeting Dion based on his race. The moment the verdict was read, Sebastian Riff collapsed in his chair. 15 years of getting away with abusing children had finally caught up with him. Judge Patricia Hawkins, who presided over the trial, didn't mince words during sentencing. "Mr. Riff, you used your position of authority to terrorize children for over a decade. You targeted the most vulnerable passengers in our aviation system, and your employer enabled your predatory behavior. You will serve 9 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release, during which you are permanently banned from any employment involving children." 9 years. Sebastian Riff would spend the next decade of his life behind bars, his flight attendant career destroyed, his reputation obliterated, his freedom gone. But the justice didn't stop there. American Airlines faced the full wrath of federal regulators and civil courts. The $15 million settlement for Dion's medical expenses and trauma was just the beginning. 3 senior executives were forced to resign in disgrace. The Department of Transportation launched a comprehensive investigation into the airline's handling of passenger complaints. Most importantly, Dion's ordeal sparked sweeping reforms across the aviation industry. The Dion Duncan Safe Lounge program was established at major airports nationwide, providing dedicated spaces where unaccompanied minors could wait safely with specially trained staff. Federal regulations now require airlines to investigate any complaint involving children within 48 hours and report patterns of misconduct to authorities. Judge Duncan emerged as a national advocate for passenger safety, testifying before Congress and working with aviation authorities to ensure no other child would suffer what his son had endured. And Dion, the 10-year-old boy who had been brutally assaulted for asking for apple juice, found strength he never knew he had. His recovery was long and difficult, requiring multiple surgeries and months of therapy, but he refused to let Sebastian Riff's violence define him. At 11 years old, Dion started speaking at aviation safety conferences, sharing his story to help protect other children. Colin Paul was honored by the Congressional Medal of Honor Foundation for his courage in protecting a child. The man who could have stayed in his seat and minded his own business instead became a hero whose split-second decision to intervene saved Dion from even more severe injuries. The ripple effects of one violent slap on an airplane transformed an entire industry. Sebastian Riff thought he could discipline a child with impunity. Instead, he triggered a reckoning that exposed years of institutional corruption and created protections for millions of future young travelers. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment. Sometimes it's about transformation. And sometimes, the worst moments in our lives become the catalyst for changes that protect countless others from experiencing the same trauma. If you believe that standing up for children against institutional corruption matters, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because stories like this need to be told, shared, and remembered.